Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another video from me, Mr. Morse. And today we're going to talk about Roman history. We're going to talk about the mythical beginnings of it, yeah, a story that's not true. And then we're going to talk about how it actually got started. And then we're going to talk about some big wars that they got into to basically expand the area. This is about Rome being very young and growing into itself. We're going to talk about some words that are important, vocabulary words that you've probably already heard earlier. Origins, which means how it got started, adapt, how they learn things from other people and make it their own, and treaty, how they come to an agreement with another society. The origins on how Rome got started, or the myth, if you will. The first one has to do with Romulus and Remus. Romulus and Remus were supposedly two twin boys that were born of the war god Mars. Remember, this is just a story. Their mother hid them away because her uncle was the leader of an early tribe of people called the Latiums. And you remember that term if you were listening carefully to the geography video. So her uncle was the leader of this Latium group. And so one night, her uncle, who was jealous and worried that these two twins would grow up and challenge his authority to the Latium tribe, he sent two soldiers off to kill the two boys. But when the soldiers got there and saw the babies, they couldn't kill them. So they put them in a basket and sent them down the Tiber River and told the uncle that they were dead. Well, the baby's basket came to the shore of the Tiber River right next to a wolf. And as a good myth will have it, the babies were taken out of the basket by the wolf and raised by the she wolf until they were both about 5. So they were wild animals themselves. Well, after being raised for 5 or 6 years by this she wolf, a woodsman found them and took them in and raised them as his own sons and taught them how to become men. Well, upon being raised, they heard the story of babies found and raised by a wolf. And later, of course, the woodsman told him that's where he found them. And then they also heard the story that they may be descendants of the war god Mars, hidden away from the evil leader of the Latium tribe. So the brothers concocted a plan to kill their jealous uncle, and they did. And they became the leaders of the Latium tribe. Well, now the story isn't over yet because they decided to build a new city for their Latium people. Remus, one of the brothers, wanted to build it right along the Tiber, right on the flat area where they could grow crops. Romulus, on the other hand, said, no, we need to build it on the 7 hills where we can be protected. And they got into a terrible fight. And as you can tell right here by this picture of Remus, Romulus cut his brother's throat and killed him. This is a myth. And upon doing so, he started building the city in the hills. And he named this city Rome after himself. So I guess the mantra or the moral of the story is might makes right. It's very fitting because this is Rome in a nutshell. Might makes right. How did it actually begin? Well, it actually started, if you remember from our geography section, a very small farming village with fertile land. And to the north of them were a group of people called the Etruscans, who had been there for many hundred years, and to the south of them, a group of people who were very intelligent, living to the boot of the peninsula, known as the Greeks. So around 800 BC, or 800 years before Jesus, Rome started as a farm village. To the north of them, once again, the Etruscans. And the Etruscans were smart people. They had a great military, they had great architecture, had magnificent buildings, they had great farming, and they had a kingship. Kings ruled the land. And to the south, they had Greece. Math, science, religion, very intelligent people. And here in the middle is Little Rome, if you remember from our geography discussion. So one day, the Etruscans come over and conquer and take Rome into their fold and make them part of their civilization. Now, this is actually a good thing for Rome. Rome was a group of farmers who didn't really know a lot. But under the guise and tutelage of the Etruscans, they learned about how to have a military, they learned about architecture, they learned new farming techniques that made their people have more food, and above everything else, they learned how to have a king. They were under the Etruscan king, and later when we get into culture, we'll talk about what happens with that. To the south, of course, were the Greeks, and they, as I said earlier, were known for their religion. Now, what the Romans did to the Etruscans was they would later overthrow the Etruscans using their own military techniques the Etruscans taught them. And then they commanded this entire northern region. And for about 100 or so years, that was great. They were very content on having this area. But around the year 500 BC, they looked down here and saw the Greeks. And the Greeks were slowly inching their way up the boot towards the Romans. So the Romans decided to attack first. And the Romans came down here and took over the Greek lands. Now, the Greeks were having a civil war back in their native land of Greece. And so, really, the Greeks thought, fine, have it. We have other problems to deal with. But in taking the Greek land, they also learned about the religion and fell in love with the Greek gods, making them very, very Roman. But they loved the Greek gods, and it replaced it. This religion replaced the Roman religion and became the number one religion in Rome. More on that when we get to the religion of Rome. After they took over the entire boot, the Etruscans are gone, the Greeks are gone, and now Rome controls the entire Italian peninsula. Things should be great, right? And for a little while they were, for a couple hundred years, till around 300 BC. Then they looked over and saw a group of people called the Carthaginians, which were a seafaring people. Now, Rome had conquered the Etruscans with their army, and they conquered the Greeks with their army. Now they controlled this whole area, but the Romans did not have a navy. They were not a seafaring people. They had an army and they grew crops, but that's about it. The Carthaginians were seafaring. They had a navy and they were very good at it. This is a picture of what Carthage would have looked like. And if you look at these massive boats sailing in and out of this rotunda, this was a very, very advanced society, far more advanced than the Roman society was at this point around the year 300 BC. So the First Punic War started, and Punic, by the way, is the word Carthage in Latin or Roman. The Romans said, hey, you Carthaginians, you guys are taking over the islands of Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. You guys are getting too close to Rome. We want these territories. We want you guys to leave. And Carthage said, no way. We're taking this area over. And Rome said, well, I'll tell you what, how about you join our republic, which was their early government, and we will rule over you and we won't, mess with you. And Carthage thought, you guys are a bunch of punks. Who are you to tell us what to do? You don't even have a navy. How are you going to stop us from growing? You can't get beyond your boot, and we can sail anywhere we want. Well, it was on. Rome said, fine, then we go to war. Now, Hamilcar Barca was the leader of the Carthaginians at the time. He was their main sailor and he was their naval captain. As you can see in this picture, he's pointing over at Rome, basically saying, hey, you farmers over here that control this peninsula, you have nothing against us great seafaring people. But as the Romans proved earlier with what they did to the Etruscans and the Greeks, they adapted other people's ideas, and all they needed was a chance. And that happened one day when some Carthaginian ships sailed up to the Roman coastline, and the Romans came over here and attacked the ships. Almost like pirates, they took these ships over. And the first thing they did was they studied them. They tore them apart and they rebuilt them several times, and then they made many of their own boats. The Romans now had a navy, and they took it directly from the Carthaginians. They adapted it directly from them. So now what happens? Well, finally, after beating for about 20 years, after beating Carthage at their own naval game, the Carthaginians said, fine, take the islands of Sardinia, Corsica, and we're done. We don't want anything else to do with it. The three islands were taken by Rome, and Carthage went back to their own. Now, you think that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. Because a few years later, Hannibal Barca, the son of Hamilcar Barca, was so angry with what happened to his father, he wanted to fight them too. He put up an army and said, let's go take out Rome once and for all. They took the three islands away from my father, but they will not take this away from me. He had a plan. He, Hannibal Barca, was going to invade Rome not by sea, but by land. He was stationed over here in what was ancient Spain, and he decided to take his army of 90,000 men, 30,000 horses, and even elephants, and go along this area here. And along the way, he was picking up different allies and groups that wanted to fight against Rome. He told them of their plan, and they thought it was crazy because he wanted to travel into the mountains. He wanted to go into the Alps. He wanted to go there and he wanted to fight Rome on the backside of the city, a place that was protected by the Seven Hills and the Pyrenees Mountains and the Apennine Mountains that you learned about in geography. Everybody thought he was crazy, but many people jumped in to do it. And he took his soldiers and they came out of the Alps after 3 years of traveling. From here to here, 3 years. Well, the Romans weren't looking for anything like that to happen. And eventually, when the Romans figured out what was happening, they sent an army here to attack and fight against Hannibal. Hannibal almost got to the city of Rome. He was so close. Upon fighting, the Romans were losing a battle, for they were not ready to fight this battle. And if it wasn't for some smart Roman ingenuity, they thought, if the Carthaginian army is here fighting us, who is protecting Carthage down here? So they sent a bunch of soldiers here in sea in the navy, a bunch of navy boats with soldiers in down here to attack Carthage. At this point, when the Carthaginian soldiers heard about this, they begged Hannibal to stop the battle here and take the battle back to Carthage to stop the city from being ruined. And that was a major mistake because when they got there, the Battle of Zama in North Africa, the Roman army was waiting for them. And as you can see from this picture, the Roman army attacked the elephants of Hannibal and attacked the Carthaginian soldiers and destroyed them. If Hannibal would have stayed in the mountains and kept continuing to attack the Roman city from the backside, he probably would have won. So, what happened at the end of the war? Well, they defeated them and they had a treaty. And the treaty was, here's what we want from you. We want you to give us Spain and Gaul and Italy. Give it to us. It's no longer Carthaginian. You're going to cut your navy down to only 10 ships, and you're going to pay us an amazing amount of money back then. You're going to pay us every year for 50 years not to attack and destroy you. We're talking millions of dollars, or according to this, 10,000 talents, which was huge back then. And they agreed, and the treaty was on. What finally happened in the end? Well, there was a third war. And finally, after many years of paying this annual payment not to attack them, they rebelled. And Rome finally brought the boom. They brought thousands and thousands and thousands of Roman soldiers to go into Carthage and completely level it and destroy it. They hated Carthage so much they tore it apart brick by brick and destroyed the entire city and everybody in it. They even took tons of salt and rubbed it into the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. And to this day in Tunisia, northern Africa, parts of northern Africa, no grass or anything grows because of what they did to the Carthaginians. You've heard the old saying, rubbing salt in your enemy's wounds. This is where it comes from. Well, after those Punic Wars, folks, nothing stopped Rome here in the red from growing. Remember from those wars, the first war, they got these 3 islands. The second war, they got all of this from Hannibal. And after the third war, they took over Carthage, and nothing was going to stop them from expanding. Rome now was going to grow faster and quicker than ever before. Now that you're done hearing about Roman history, I'd like you to pre read pages 412 to 415 and look at the pictures and the captions. Keep in mind how a father would teach his son, Hamilcar would teach his son Hannibal to hate Rome so much. The question I have for you today is: has your father ever taught you something that you're good at right now? Thanks. Hope you learned something. Talk to you soon.